Coraline!
Jones!
I am a children's therapist. I have been discussing the psychology of Coraline a lot recently, specifically this video on attachment theory, but the psychoanalytical theories are not yet over. There is one more video I want to make about Coraline, perhaps the clearest interpretation we can make of this film from a psychological point of view. I just think this story does lend itself perfectly to psychoanalysis. You've got a girl named Coraline who is just moving into a new home at a time where her parents have a very hard deadline to hit with work. She feels bored and neglected by her parents and fairly angry with them. She wants to go outside to play, but her mum says it's too wet and muddy, therefore she gets bored around the house and then discovers this door that leads through a weird tunnel to a parallel version of her home, but with other parents, and other mother and another father who have buttons for eyes. And I think this is just meaningful in terms of a child's psychological development. We need to talk about the concept of splitting here, and we need to talk about an old psychoanalyst called Melanie Klein and her theory of object relations. Yes, if that sounds interesting, then watch this train move across the water and then we'll begin. So you might have heard of the term splitting. It's one I do mention quite a bit on this channel because it comes up a lot in stories and characters. The world is a nuanced, morally grey, ambivalent thing. Generally, most things are neither all good or all bad. They tend to be a confusing, messy mixture of both. And that is really confusing, and the uncertainty isn't pleasant, it's stressful, and so sometimes you want to put everything into neat, black and white camps. Splitting is a defense mechanism to help you cope with stress there, essentially, to start seeing things or certain people as either all good or all bad. This one teacher I have is amazing and does nothing wrong, another teacher is the devil incarnate. Sometimes parents do it a little bit with children, to a degree, on a spectrum, hopefully not literally thinking one of their children is evil, but they might subconsciously perceive or react to one sibling as the good child and another one as the bad one. Horrid Henry would be a fitting children's story for that idea. He's literally called Horrid Henry while his brother is Perfect Peter. That can be quite damaging for a child. It is. It's difficult, but also really relatable. I think a lot of us would have experienced that kind of scenario. What does all of this have to do with Coraline? Well, yeah, Coraline has two versions of her parents at the beginning of this. She is also splitting. Her real parents are seen as all bad. They ignore her, they don't listen, they don't get her the things she wants, they don't let her play outside. We see her often very angry with them, but her other mother and other father are all good. They give her everything she wants, they listen to everything she says, they don't just let her play outside, they encourage it and they play with her. Her dad doesn't sing terrible, embarrassing songs the way the real one does, he sings absolute bangers with full-blown piano hands. Isn't it so much simpler when you just split everything like that? To begin with, the other parents are kind of everything Coraline desires, and to that extent you could see this world as a symbolic one. You could interpret this story to say that Coraline has imagined them. They are her fantasy to escape feeling neglected and abandoned by her real parents, and that could be a really interesting interpretation of the film. I think I've just done it there for you, but I don't think that's necessarily the case, as we are going to come to, but it's still all very, very relevant to a child's struggles growing up, because there are points in your lives growing up where you start to realise just how flawed your parents are. I mean, sometimes a lot worse than just flawed. I think this film isn't necessarily exploring that though, but it's really, really hard because they're the people you grew up depending on. You were a helpless baby who needed them for everything, literally stuck, unable to move, crying for them to relieve your hunger that would kill you otherwise. And then you get older and a little bit more independent, but still very much depending on them. And the idea that they might not be entirely reliable anymore, sometimes disappointing, unsatisfactory, maybe even hurtful, that's a hell of a blow. If you start to feel like you can't depend on them for everything, who do you depend on instead? It's unsurprising Coraline then might want someone else, might want to plug that gap, and therefore might find the idea of this other mother so appealing. My parents let me down, so let's fantasize about a version of them that never lets me down. That's a psychological defense, right? Yes. Yes, it is. The psychoanalyst Melanie Klein spoke about this way back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s-ish. I don't know when things were formulated. In her words, it was the good breast, bad breast, which probably aren't the best words for it. But you got this helpless, vulnerable baby who literally depends on their caregiver for survival. This presence they don't yet understand as a separate human being, so much as just this being of care and nurture that brings them good sensations and food and warmth. It feels good when that caregiver is there, but also there are times when the caregiver isn't there, or isn't so attentive, and that feels bad for the baby. You know, I'm this infant who's hit with this horrible feeling of hunger that I don't even understand what the feeling is. It's just this life-threatening pain and I can't stop it, and my caregiver isn't appearing to get rid of it. I don't know, maybe they don't appear for 30 seconds, a minute, two. That feels like a long time for a baby. That's bad. That's all quite a simplified example, but basically you end up with a baby that feels good and bad towards this caregiver. The caregiver is often just called the mother in the old psychoanalytic writing, but it basically means caregiver, whoever that is, maybe several people at once, because the baby isn't necessarily seeing them as distinct people here. But yeah, the baby feels good about this presence because they bring nurture and care and warm feelings, but the baby also feels bad that that presence can go away at times. Why can't they give me all those good feelings all of the time? Can't they see how much I need them? I want to possess that and never let it go, so the fact it does go at times, I feel resentful and angry and jealous, and maybe a little part of me wants to just destroy them, which is where Melanie Klein starts talking about when babies might very aggressively bite the mother's nipple, but let's not go down that rabbit hole today. The point is just that the baby feels good and bad things towards this caring presence, and that's really confusing because this isn't a baby that has a full concept of what a separate human being is. It's strange, it's hard to wrap your head around. There's also identity troubles. Does the infant have a concept of itself as something separate yet? That's a whole nother layer to this that I don't think we should get into today. Generally, yeah, how do you understand this good and bad feelings? Here, as you may have suspected, is the beginnings of that psychological defense splitting. It's too confusing to feel good and bad at the same time, so you decide there must be two versions of this strange caregiver. The good one and the bad one. The one who does care and the one who is evil. The good breast and the bad breast. There you go. Simplified it quite a bit there, but that's the theory in a nutshell, or the first part of the theory. Understanding ambivalence and nuance is a massive part of maturity, and in this first stage it's too much of a struggle, so you do split stuff into two very distinct, rigid camps. Which, yes, we can see playing out in the film Coraline. Only there's one slight snag here. I was just talking about a baby and an infant's experiences, but Coraline is just a bit older than that, as far as I can tell. Coraline is an 11-year-old girl. She is of course growing and learning, but she still has so much to learn, and it's great watching someone develop like that. It is heartening, but the only thing better than watching is getting to learn things yourself. This video is sponsored by Skillshare, the biggest online community for learning an array of different topics, thousands of different classes. Yes, you may already be aware I've been using Skillshare recently, mainly for writing related courses or pitching to publishers, but there are lots of other things to explore. We've got film, photography, languages, coding, cooking, gardening. Really clear, all cut into chapters, often with community projects. And more than courses, you even get learning paths, where people have carefully put together a collection of courses that run smoothly together and just make learning so much less daunting and so much more straightforward. Whatever it is you want to learn, I assume you want to learn something in life. The first 500 people to click this link get a free month trial. Yep. Free time to learn stuff, so click that in the description or the pinned comment, and then we'll get back to Coraline. Right, sorry for that. I was just talking with Klein about infants and babies with the good breast and the bad breast malarkey. But what I was going to say is it's not just about that. There is a struggle here that can rear its head to different extremes over and over again at different points in our lives, particularly under enough stress. You know, I think I experience it doing film criticism online because that can be incredibly polarised, where people want to talk about films in an either all good or all bad way, and sometimes when I try and find that sort of nuanced middle ground, it can frustrate people. And by the way, that's not me saying these people are like immature or incapable of nuance, by the way, because they won't be. It's just finding nuance is confusing and stressful, muddling around in the middle ground of things. Sometimes you do just want clear answers. When you're under enough stress, you kind of lose the headspace to think about things in a more nuanced way. In Klein's words, though, this early infant struggle of ambivalence where you are splitting is called the paranoid schizoid position for some reason. Ideally, with the right support and development, the infant later reaches what Klein called the depressive position, which is when you realise, actually, yes, the good and bad are within the same person. My parents are flawed and they do let me down, but they're also goods and they love me. I feel angry towards them, but I'm also grateful and loving, and a big melting pot of different contradictory stuff. It's called the depressive position because there's a little bit of grief here. It means letting go of the idea that there is any perfect, all-good, idealised version of things out there. It means settling for something a little bit more grey, and that is kind of disappointing, naturally. It also brings up a level of guilt, because this all-bad figure you've been so angry towards, that person isn't all bad at all. They're the same person you've also been loving. You've been very angry at someone who cares, and that does bring up a level of guilt, rightly or not. And if there is space for that feeling of guilt to be properly explored and processed, it hopefully leads towards the development of empathy. This is how Melanie Klein saw it all. What does the movie Coraline say? Well, yes, Coraline is under a lot of stress and these feelings of ambivalence that she won't have come to some perfect conclusion about anyway. They rear up with more intensity, and this other world with this other mother provides the perfect space and template for Coraline to split things. She might consciously understand that her parents just happen to be massively busy and stressed these particular couple of days. She might get that, but she might also still feel, well, why can't they have made time for me? Why can't they work a bit quicker? A little part of her might worry she's not wanted or not important enough to them. And then when the other mother becomes symbolic for the all good, suddenly everything about her real parents is terrible. The whole world is terrible. You know, I like this exchange a lot.
Your school might be fun. With those stupid uniforms? Right. Had to give it a try.
School absolutely could be fun, and a part of Coraline probably knows that deep down, but it's not the point. Splitting is her means of coping right now, so everything her mum argues here, everything about the ordinary world, has to be seen as terrible. This is where she is dumping all the negative feelings. She is angry with her mum for not buying her gloves as well, so she needs to be totally negative towards everything, resist her mum's attempts to cheer her up so she can show her mum just how very upset she is. I just love that because it feels so real, you know? Wybe also could be fun. Nope, he's annoying. The neighbours are weird and boring. Everything sucks in this real world, but not in the other one. There is a real anger Coraline expresses here. So much of it, and that's really important. Coraline is at first all too happy to leave her real parents, even relishes the idea of abandoning them in some kind of small revenge.
Won't be long. But I might be.
And then everything changes. The other mother is revealed to be a villain, and Coraline is in danger, and now she wants to get back to the real world. After great difficulty, she does get back. She's really excited to see them. She's missed them, only they're not there, because the other mother has taken them prisoner. Let me try and not make this too messy. There's two ways we could interpret this moment. The first way is that everything has flipped. The mum that seemed all good is now perceived as evil, and the one that seemed all bad is now perceived as perfect. Coraline hasn't grown, she is still splitting in just the same way, only it's the big switcheroo. Her opinions have reversed. And that could be the case, that genuinely happens more than you'd think. The amount of times I've seen teachers or social workers talking about the parents of a child where they're like, the dad is the problem, he's everything that's so wrong, and then things get a bit more muddled and it's too confusing, and then suddenly it's decided actually it's the mum, she's the problem. They've switched the splitting around. In reality, no, maybe it's more confusing than just a single person to blame. Maybe blame isn't the point. But that's a tangent. One interpretation is that that's what goes on. Coraline's view is just flipped. And I think if you make an interpretation of this film where the other mother isn't actually real, that this is all a fantasy of Coraline's, then that could make a lot of sense. But personally, I don't think that's what happens. I think Coraline here lets go of her splitting defense mechanism, and that doing that is precisely why she starts to see how very villainous the other mother actually is. Doing that is precisely why she realizes the other mother isn't actually her other mother at all, has nothing to do with her mother. All of Coraline's personal confused feelings about her mum aren't tied to this beldam figure. She is in fact just a monster called the beldam who chose to disguise herself like that. Does that make sense? Okay, Coraline's parents were pretty neglectful and she started to doubt that they cared or listened to her, and the beldam capitalized on that. Became an easy means to feed Coraline's splitting mechanism. The other mother isn't a projection of Coraline's fantasy version of her parents, it's the beldam presenting herself as what she thinks would appeal to Coraline. There's a difference there. But we get to this point in the film and Coraline misses her real parents. She is angry with them, yes, but she also loves them. She still finds Wybie annoying, but also likes him and wants his help. I think she may even feel guilt here for having effectively left her parents behind and caused the beldam to imprison them. A recognition of good and bad, a level of guilt and grief. Is this Melanie Klein's depressive position? Well, look at it this way. There comes a point in this movie where the beldam stops looking like Coraline's mum. She becomes less motherly and more spidery. Is this because Coraline stops associating her as anything mum-like, stops projecting a version of her mum onto the beldam, whether that is the all-good side or the all-bad? The way Coraline sees the beldam is increasingly less tied up in her feelings of her mum, and suddenly the beldam represents none of that for Coraline. In my opinion, that recognition is Coraline's biggest moment of growth in this film. But I'm struggling to explain it, so let me try again. We began this film with two distinct worlds, and two distinct worldviews split into two. Everything is grey and dull and bad, and then everything over here is the best. Then these two worlds start to blur and butt heads against each other. We've got this cat that can flip between both sides. We connect ideas of Wybie's grandmother in the real world to the children in the other world. We've got her parents entering the other world as prisoners. Suddenly, this rigid split two worldview systems starts merging into one singular view, where Coraline no longer needs the other world or the other mother because everything she was previously projecting there is now integrated into the real world. And in that sense, it's in reaching the depressive position that Coraline is able to recognise that about the other world and is then able to succeed in this film. And I kind of mean that thematically as well. She accepts reality for what it is, despite its flaws. It's grey and muddy and wet, but also sunny and fun and so many different things. As a result, she doesn't need to indulge in some fantasy magical alternative because it's all integrated here. Had she not felt like that though, perhaps a part of her would have still been swayed by the other world, would have fallen victim to the beldam's trap. It is all too easy for that to happen. That's kind of the horror of this film. Let me make one more point before we finish. I know, based on the comments of my previous videos, that a lot of people don't like it when I'm not condemning Coraline's parents as being awful and abusive. You know, I think her parents don't fulfill Coraline's needs well enough for the small window of time within which this film takes place, but based on Coraline's general behaviour, I think they are normally much better than this. Kind of like we see at the end. Coraline, I think, displays signs of a secure attachment that I discussed in my first video.
Where are my parents?
Perhaps they've grown bored of you and run away to France.
They weren't bored of me, you stole them!
There is a thin line here though, because it'd be very easy for genuinely abusive parents to justify it by saying, oh, we're just stressed, we've got lots of work, it's your fault for not understanding that, Coraline, get used to the real world. That could easily be the case, and that definitely does happen in far too many families. I once made a video about tough love and how that whole concept can very easily become an excuse for abuse. But I personally don't believe that stuff is the case in this specific film. And I think in an ideal world, what we're getting is parents who are flawed and don't always meet Coraline's needs, which is really, really difficult. That's so hard for Coraline here, but it's also an important part of development. Because people, the world, everything does let us down sometimes. And that sucks. But if we have space to express our hurts and then to process that and work through it and maybe be given some comfort about it, hopefully that can lead to a level of acceptance. This is why it's so important that Coraline does vent so much anger to her parents. It's uncomfortable and it's tricky, but it's a part of the grief and the frustration that something as magical as this other world doesn't actually exist. She needs to be expressing that to develop, and we do see that development in a lot of ways, not just the general worldview, but also, I think, independence in this film. Coraline begins wanting her parents' total attention, feeling dependent on them for what to do. Therefore, it angers her when she can't rely on their undivided attention, so she seeks the other mother to compensate for that. And when the other mother isn't right, she creates this pillow and cushion versions to compensate in a way that makes me think of transitional objects. Transitional objects was a phrase I think coined by psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott to basically mean an object that symbolises all of that parental care. Remember I said about an infant wishing they could hold on to the caregiver at all times? Well, they can't, and so babies often seek teddies or sometimes blankets to cuddle and hold tight and see as symbols of that same care. It's a transitional object. I can't possess my caregiver, but I can at least possess an object that partly symbolises the same thing. I don't think that's really what this moment in the film is about, but I think it's a good expression for that concept. You begin totally dependent, then you express frustration that you can't totally depend, then you find a transitional object to kind of compensate for that, and then hopefully this object, this experience of care becomes internalised well enough that you don't need to hold onto some external thing to feel like you've still got it. Hopefully it starts to feel inside of you. It's kind of like being able to trust that a person still thinks of you even when you don't see them, even when you're not in the same room, or that they're out at work or whatever. You've got their love and care within your heart. And because those feelings have been internalised, you're then more able to act independently. Which, yeah, this film is also about Coraline feeling dependent and then discovering some of her independence and her confidence and her bravery. There's a bigger reason I brought up transitional objects though. You can't possess that person of care, so you create an object that symbolises it. Doesn't that feel relevant when this is a film all about the idea of dolls? We get lots of dolls here, and the problem for the other mother, I think, is that she kind of does the reverse of this with transitional objects. Rather than material dolls being a kind of compensation that enables you to gradually accept you are separate from your carers. You are an individual, you don't need to hold on to them tight, you don't need to possess them, you don't need to kind of consume them because that feeling of care is already inside you. Yeah, instead of that, the beldam kind of wants to possess people and effectively turn them into the dolls, if that makes sense. The material object isn't enough, she has to put a real person into that object. And we know that happens in this movie because the other father and other Wybie are both sentient beings who don't want to do the beldam's bidding. They want to help Coraline. They betray the beldam in order to help Coraline, but they are also beings that have in some way been warped into these playthings of hers. I suppose in a way they are all transitional objects, but they're not enough for her. There needs to be more and more, and they need to be consumed. And when the way to keep Coraline trapped in this other world is sewing buttons into her eyes, you realise Coraline would be becoming a doll too. You realise that this doll version of Coraline at the start of the film isn't just a means to entice Coraline into the other world, it's an object of exactly what Coraline is supposed to become. And in general I find that idea really, really cool. Doll Coraline was a great addition to the movie. We've talked a lot about Coraline splitting people. There's the annoying YB and the silent other YB, the embarrassing dad and the fun other dad, the mother and the other mother. Well, there's also Coraline and the other Coraline. Yep. And if we've spoken about how all of these different split characters relate to Coraline's own splitting mechanism, I wonder what this doll might say about her own sense of self. Yes, I'm leaving that question open-ended. Too bad. I hope you enjoyed this much more rambling, haphazard Coraline analysis than my other ones were. I really struggled to find the words here. It's probably also the last Coraline one I will do. I do have an idea for possibly one more video about this film. It's possible, but I don't feel like it's substantial enough. I don't want to just make content for the sake of it, you know? So, comment your thoughts, good and bad. We can integrate both of them. Likes and dislikes, subscribers, non-subscribers. Those of you who choose to support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee, and those of you who don't, we can integrate them all. Otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Grace, Kellyanne Davidson, Luke Orr, Michael Gallagher, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.